My name is Joyce Whitmore. I'm 39 years old. And this is the story of how my mother and uncle humiliated me one last time, unaware that I already owned the very hotel they laughed in. It was a Friday morning in mid-September when I arrived at the Belmau Hotel, a Spanish-style estate perched just above the cliffs of Half Moon Bay. The breeze smelled like salt and broken promises. I stepped out of my rental car and stood for a moment, staring up at the building that had become both a family landmark and a personal reminder of everything I wasn't allowed to be. I didn't feel nervous. I felt observant. Coldly observant. Because this time, I wasn't here to be seen, I was here to see them. Belmau had always been our family's reunion spot. Every September, my mother Ellen and her brother Gregory would organize a bonding getaway. They'd rent out the whole hotel for 3 days of forced cheer, manicured lies, and whispered gossip. But this year, there was one thing none of them knew: I owned the hotel. Legally. Quietly. Completely. 6 months ago, my grandfather Charles, our family's patriarch, died. And when the final trust documents were revealed, he left Belmau entirely to me. No conditions. No shared ownership. Just my name on the deed and a handwritten note that read, "Joyce sees more than they think. She always has." I'd kept it secret. On purpose. Because I needed to understand, fully and without their filters, how they truly saw me. When I walked into the lobby, the air felt slightly damp with fog, and the marble floor shone like it had just been polished. At the front desk, I saw Mark, the assistant manager I had personally promoted just 2 months ago. He spotted me and gave a tiny, nearly imperceptible nod. I stepped up and kept my voice low. "Room 116. The usual." Mark blinked. "You don't have to take that room, Miss Whitmore. We've prepared." I said room 116, I repeated, calm but firm. "Let's see if they're still willing to put me next to the laundry chute now that I own the whole place." Mark hesitated, then handed me the key card. "Yes, ma'am." I turned just in time to see them. My mother, Ellen, elegant in her wine-colored shawl and perfectly curled hair, was greeting guests near the indoor fountain. Her arm was around my younger sister, Carla, who looked like she'd stepped off the cover of a lifestyle magazine. Carla had just been promoted to senior VP at a Napa wine company. Everyone adored her. The golden daughter. The polished one. No one noticed me walk in. Not a single head turned. It had always been that way. Carla spotted me first. Her smile flickered on, then off, like a candle in a gust of wind. "Oh. You made it." My mother barely looked in my direction. She reached for another champagne flute and went back to mingling. I stood for a second longer than I should have, then walked toward the elevator, heels echoing across the floor. The door to room 116 creaked when I opened it. The air was stale. A single window faced the parking lot. Beige paint peeled in the corners. The wall vibrated slightly from the industrial dryers next door. Same as always. This was the room they had given me for the past 8 years. Not because it was all that was left, but because they believed that was all I deserved. I sat on the twin bed, still in my coat, and looked around. This time, the shame didn't sink into my bones like it used to. It didn't sting. It confirmed everything I already knew. The mold near the ceiling, the rust-stained pipe in the corner, the flickering light above the dresser. It was all a message. That evening was the welcome dinner. The hotel restaurant, Seaside Salt, was already lit with candles by the time I arrived. My family sat at a long, ocean-facing table. I walked in precisely on time, but the only available seat was half blocked by a large decorative column. Hidden. Disconnected. I took it anyway. My mother tapped her fork against her glass. "Let's begin, shall we? I hope everyone's enjoying the Belmau experience, especially Carla, who's just been promoted to senior VP." Applause erupted. I clapped too, softly. Thank you, Mom, Carla said, all polished grace. I'm just doing my part. Uncle Gregory leaned forward. Joyce, what about you? Still doing that little, freelancing thing? I nodded. Yes. I run my design studio. Carla gave a sideways smirk. Graphic design, right? With all the AI out now, I heard those jobs are basically obsolete. Laughter floated down the table. I took a sip of water. Uncle Gregory chuckled. Tough times, huh? But don't worry. We always help family. That's rich, I thought. Before I could reply, Chef Raymond appeared beside me. He gave a slight bow. Miss Whitmore, did the salmon salad meet your expectations this evening? A hush fell over the table. I smiled. Perfect. Thank you. Raymond bowed again and left. I caught Carla's stunned expression. You know the chef here, she asked. We've worked together before, I replied calmly. They didn't ask more. No one ever really asked me anything that mattered. Later, during dessert, my mother turned to me. So, Joyce, still working from home? Mostly, I answered. She nodded curtly. Probably saves on office rent. Carla crossed her arms. You ever think about doing something more stable? That little studio can't be easy. I didn't answer. I wasn't there to defend my life. I was there to observe theirs. That night, I lay in the moldy smelling room, listening to the roar of the laundry machines. And instead of anger, I felt focus. Clarity. This wasn't just family favoritism. It was systemic erasure. Generation-deep dismissal wrapped in polite smiles and cutting remarks. And I had every intention of unraveling it all. They had no idea the woman sleeping beside the utility closet already held every key in the building, and the final word in their fates. The morning light leaked in weakly through the dusty curtain, casting a narrow stripe across the faded carpet. I lay awake long before sunrise, listening to the familiar metallic grind of the laundry machines next door. I hadn't needed an alarm clock since stepping into this room. Every groan of the pipe, every clang of a misaligned dryer drum, it all came back to me like a song I never chose to memorize. I dressed quietly, tied my hair up, and stepped into the hallway just as the rest of the hotel was still asleep. The corridor smelled faintly of citrus cleaner. On my way to the cafe, I passed a young red-haired barista arranging the pastry display behind the counter. Savannah. She had once interned under my grandfather. When she saw me, her face lit up with a quiet warmth. Good morning, Miss Joyce. Your almond latte is ready. I also saved a slice of banana bread, just how you like it. I glanced around. The hallway was still empty. Thanks, Savannah, I said softly. But let's keep things casual, okay? Just Joyce. She hesitated, then nodded with a smile. Understood. But it's hard to pretend you're just a guest. You're not invisible here. I didn't answer. Instead, I took the cup. On the lid, drawn in black ink, was a small bird, its wings mid-flutter. The bluefinch. My studio's logo. Savannah winked and turned back to the espresso machine. I left without another word, heart just a little fuller than it had been the night before. Most of the family was split between two activities that morning, a vineyard tour and a guided meditation at the spa. I claimed a headache and slipped away up to the 4th floor, where my grandfather's private office still stood. It was untouched. The same dark wood door, the Whitmore wolf crest still carved into the center. I unlocked it with a small silver key Mark had delivered to me when I first assumed ownership. Inside, the office looked just as I remembered. Ocean light poured in through the tall window, bouncing off the black marble desk. Shelves lined with books, business ledgers, and framed photographs surrounded the room like sentinels. On the desk, a silver-trimmed wooden box sat centered and perfectly aligned. I opened it slowly. Inside were my grandfather's journals, old business plans, and personal letters. I traced my fingers over a few pages where he wrote about his regrets, the family fractures, the betrayals he couldn't stop. One passage stopped me cold. Gregory and Ellen keep pushing. They want the hotel sold to Robert. I know their angle. It's about control. Joyce is the only one who listens without scheming. She understands legacy. The others only understand leverage. I closed the journal just as the door creaked behind me. Joyce, came Carla's voice, suspicious and sharp. I turned slowly. What are you doing in here? She asked, stepping into the office. Her eyes darted around the room like she was trying to memorize everything she saw. Just visiting an old memory, I said. She frowned. I tried to come in yesterday. The staff said it was off limits. Maybe they were mistaken, I replied evenly. Mark said I needed clearance, she pushed. Do you know Mark that well? I tilted my head. I know a lot of people, Carla. You've just never asked. Her expression darkened, but then her brow furrowed, like a realization was brewing in the back of her mind. Savannah called you MS owner this morning. I heard it. I stepped toward the window, hiding the flicker in my eyes. Probably a joke. She didn't sound like she was joking. I said nothing more, and she eventually turned to leave, but her face stayed with me, confused, calculating, a little afraid. That evening, our second dinner was held in the rooftop bistro, a space lined with soft amber lighting and panoramic ocean views. But the tension that had begun to surface was now spreading through the room like wildfire. Uncle Gregory's eyes lingered on me longer than they ever had. Aunt Carol, once the queen of passive-aggressive small talk, stayed oddly quiet when I requested a custom vegan dish. The restaurant manager came personally to ask how I'd like it prepared. It was a small gesture, but the ripple it caused at the table was immediate. When I stepped out to take a call from a community client, Blue Finch's latest branding project for a youth arts center, Natalie followed me into the hallway. What were you doing in Grandpa's office earlier? She asked, her voice low but pointed. I have a key, I answered flatly. Her eyes widened. Where did you get it? I didn't answer. Instead, I gave her a measured look and walked away. I didn't need to explain myself, not to someone who once told me at Christmas that I was wasting my potential doodling logos. The next morning, before sunrise, I returned to my grandfather's office. Mark had left something for me at the front desk, a sealed envelope and a vintage bronze access card. Inside the envelope, a note, "You'll need this. Trust your instincts. M." The card was faintly engraved with B3. I knew immediately what it meant. The basement archive room, room B3, was where all of my grandfather's private documents had been stored. Legal records, correspondence, journals. No family member had ever been allowed down there. Not even my mother. I took the service elevator using the card. The ride down felt colder than it should have, like the silence carried history too thick to name. Inside B3, rows of filing cabinets stood like forgotten soldiers. I moved past tax records, shareholder agreements, until I found a navy moon-colored box labeled Family Correspondence, 2004 to 2018. And there it was. A fat folder marked E. Whitmore, personal. My mother. I pulled out the letters. The first was dated July 15, 2011. Dad, I think you're spoiling Joyce too much. She's not fit to carry the legacy. She lives in a fantasy of art, and she's dragging the Whitmore name through impractical dreams. Letter after letter, I read through cold-blooded condemnations, calculated criticisms from my mother to her own father, begging him to disqualify me. She painted me as a risk, an embarrassment, a burden. At the bottom of the pile, I found something else. Handwritten notes, never sent. From Charles. Ellen, jealousy is turning your love into fear. Joyce is not a mistake. She is simply not yours to mold. I sat there for a long time in that steel-lit basement, shaking. Everything I had felt my whole life, every cold shoulder, every half-smile, every maybe you should try something safer, it was all deliberate. Not just oversight. Sabotage. And there, in a folder clipped underneath, I found a contract draft. My father Dean and Carla's husband Robert had prepared an offer to buy the hotel for 40% under its value, signed in confidence 6 months before Charles died. I stared at Robert's note. Ready to move as soon as the old man weakens. That was all I needed. Not revenge. Not rage. Just proof. I climbed the stairs back into daylight, holding truth in my hand. And for the first time, it didn't feel heavy. It felt like freedom. The sun was beginning to rise over Half Moon Bay as I stepped out of the service elevator. My legs felt hollow, like I had walked through decades instead of a basement archive. In my hand, I clutched the truth, not just ink on paper, but everything I had always suspected. My mother's campaign to erase me. My father's silence. My brother-in-law's ambition to carve me out entirely. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply stood in the empty hallway of the 4th floor, breathing in air that somehow felt different now. Lighter. Mark was waiting for me outside my grandfather's office. "Miss Joyce," he said softly, watching me carefully. "Are you all right?" "No," I replied. "But I know what I need to do." He nodded, like he had expected that answer all along. "Mr. Charles always said you had a fire in you. Even when no one else saw it." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Because from that moment on, every step I took was not for approval, it was for clarity. That night was the second family dinner, held in the grand dining hall on the 3rd floor, a glittering space meant for weddings, galas, and corporate retreats. The long table was set with white and gold, and soft music drifted from the live string quartet in the corner. It was the kind of setting my mother thrived in. Everyone was there. Aunt Carol in her usual pearls. Uncle Gregory with a blazer just tight enough to show off his recent gym efforts. Carla, of course, in a sleek navy dress that matched her husband Robert's tie. All staged like a family portrait in a magazine, one I'd never been invited to pose in. When I arrived, heads turned. Not because of what I wore, a simple black dress, no makeup, no jewelry, but because they sensed something had changed. I no longer entered like someone waiting for permission to be acknowledged. I whispered a few words to the restaurant manager, who nodded and disappeared into the kitchen. Carla raised a brow. "Special order," she called from the far end. "Just something I used to suggest to the kitchen staff," I replied casually. "Years ago." She looked amused, like I was making things up again. A few minutes later, Chef Raymond emerged, carrying a covered silver platter. He walked straight to me, placed it down, and with a small bow, lifted the lid. "Tonight's special," he announced, "is rosemary lentil stew with a balsamic glaze, a recipe Miss Joyce introduced to our kitchen several years ago. We kept it in the archive for this occasion." The room stilled. Even the quartet missed a note. Carla stared. Natalie blinked. My mother's hand froze midway through raising her wine glass. "I hope it's still up to standard," I said politely, picking up my spoon. Nobody asked me anything else for a long time. Later that evening, the main event began, the Family Member of the Year celebration. A tradition started 3 years ago by my mother. And each year, without fail, Carla had one. As expected, my mother took the center stage with a smile that could cut glass. "Tonight," she said, "we honor someone who exemplifies leadership, vision, and grace under pressure. Please join me in celebrating my daughter, Carla, our shining star." The applause erupted, pre-rehearsed, perfectly timed. Carla stood, modest as always, accepting the applause like it was a natural element of her existence. But just as the clapping faded, a voice spoke up from the center of the table. "Natalie." "Joyce," she said, not unkindly, I saw you coming out of Grandpa's office earlier today. Isn't that room locked? I set down my glass gently. I have the key. Carla's head snapped in my direction. Why would you have a key? I looked at her calmly. Because I have legal access to every part of this hotel. The room shifted. My mother's smile faltered. Robert leaned forward in his chair. Hold on, Natalie said. Are you saying you? She's bluffing, Robert interrupted. Probably sweet-talked someone on staff. No need, I said. I'm the owner. You could hear a pin drop. Carla laughed, sharp, uncomfortable. Oh, come on. This again? Joyce, what fantasy are you living in this time? It's not a fantasy, I said softly. Grandpa Charles left Belmau to me. Through a trust. 6 months ago. Robert's chair scraped sharply as he stood. If that's true, then why were you staying in the moldy room next to the dryer? To see how far you'd all go, I replied. I turned toward my father, then Robert. I saw your emails. The ones where you planned to buy the hotel for 40% under market value before Grandpa died. I saw the signatures. The bank arrangements. Everything. Robert's face flushed red. Don't pretend you care about legacy. You wanted control. Just like everyone else at this table wanted to be seen as more important than they were. My mother finally spoke, voice tight. If this were true, we would have known. Would you? I asked, my voice low. Or would you have tried to rewrite it? Like you did all those years you told Grandpa I was unfit to inherit anything? She went silent. Then, from the back of the room, a door opened. A tall, silver-haired man in a dark suit entered carrying a briefcase. I turned toward the family. This is Peter Langford, my grandfather's personal attorney for nearly 30 years. He's here to confirm everything. Gasps. Mr. Langford stepped forward and opened the briefcase, removing a sealed envelope and several neatly bound documents. As outlined in the final clause of Charles Whitmore's will, he began, I am here to read a provision activated upon the full reunion of the Whitmore family at Belmau Hotel. He cleared his throat. The Belmau Hotel was transferred into the Whitmore Legacy Trust on April 12 of last year. The sole beneficiary, with full operational control and authority, is Joyce Whitmore. No co-ownership. No shared assets. No amendments. Robert sat down hard. Carla looked like her entire face had been drained of blood. Mr. Langford continued. More importantly, Mr. Whitmore asked that I read aloud a letter to his family. Handwritten. 3 pages. He opened the letter. To my family, if you're hearing this, it means Joyce has officially assumed stewardship of Belmau. And I hope by now, you are finally ready to listen. Not with your pride. But with your hearts. Silence. My eyes stayed dry. I didn't need tears to validate this moment. Every word in that letter, every truth my grandfather had buried beneath a lifetime of polite rejection, was a torch. One that burned away the lies we'd all lived under. He ended with, Joyce, I gave you Belmau not because you needed it, but because this family needs you. Lead them if they're willing to follow. No one moved. Not even Carla. My mother's wine glass had long since been set down. Her hands trembled slightly in her lap. And for once, she didn't look at me like I was a stranger in her story. She looked at me like someone seeing their child for the first time. The room was so quiet, it felt like the chandeliers themselves had stopped swaying in the coastal breeze. Mr. Langford carefully folded the letter back into its envelope and placed it on the table in front of me. His job was done. Mine was just beginning. Across from me, Robert gripped the back of his chair, jaw clenched. I expected a reaction, rage, denial, protest. But it was the sound of him scoffing under his breath that finally broke the silence. This is just a power play, he spat, his voice rising. A pathetic performance. You think because you have a letter and a lawyer that suddenly makes you qualified to run this place? I didn't flinch. I never claimed to be perfect, I said, rising from my seat, but I don't need to scream to be heard. And I don't need to lie, cheat, or scheme to deserve my place. I built something of my own. While you all were busy measuring each other by titles and wealth, I was learning how to build trust, client by client, year after year. Robert laughed bitterly. You had things handed to you. I looked him square in the eye. No, I said. You think Grandpa handed me Belmau out of pity. But he gave it to me because he saw what none of you ever did, integrity. You all fought for position. I showed up with patience. And that scared you. Carla, still seated beside our mother, suddenly spoke. You think you're better than us? No, I replied, but I stopped believing I was less. A hush fell again, heavier this time. Madison, Robert's wife and my sister, finally turned toward him. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear. You lied to me, she said, quietly but firmly. About the hotel. About the deal with Dad. About all of it. Madison, don't start. No, she cut in, sharper now. You used me. You saw my family as an obstacle, not a connection. And I let you manipulate me into thinking Joyce was the one in the way. Robert stood still, then looked at her like he didn't recognize the woman beside him. I'll be leaving this hotel in the morning, he said tightly. And I want nothing more to do with this family. He turned and walked toward the doors. No one moved to stop him. No one begged. The doors slammed behind him with a cold finality that didn't need translation. The room sat suspended in silence again, until I finally turned toward my father. He had been quiet the entire time, hands resting on the table, head bowed slightly. Dad, I said softly, why didn't you ever speak up? He looked up. His eyes were tired, older than I remembered. Because I was weak, Joyce, he answered after a long pause. I thought siding with you would ruin whatever peace was left between your mother and me. I thought staying silent meant staying neutral. But now I know, silence is its own form of cruelty. I nodded slowly. I didn't need to shame him. His words were confession enough. From the far end of the table, Natalie propped her chin on her hand and spoke with a softness I never expected from her. You know, I used to think you were just quiet because you had nothing to say, she murmured. Now I realize your silence was patience. A kind I never learned. Madison looked over at me. Her eyes shimmered, but no tears fell. You never wanted to win, she whispered. You just wanted to be seen. I didn't answer right away. I let that truth settle into the cracks they had made over the years. Finally, I said, I just wanted to be treated like a person. Not a prop. Not a problem. Not a placeholder for someone else's expectations. Then my mother did something no one expected. She placed her hand on the table and leaned forward slightly. Joyce, she said, her voice trembling, I didn't hate you because you failed. I hated you because you didn't need me to succeed. No one said a word. Because we all felt the truth in that moment, raw, real, almost too heavy to carry. Some apologies don't come dressed in tears or flowers. They come dressed in decades of bitterness finally stripped away. I didn't forgive her, not in that instant. But I didn't walk away either. I'm hosting a meeting tomorrow morning, I said instead. 4th floor. Conference room behind Grandpa's painting. It's not to divide shares or settle scores. It's about what comes next. Anyone who wants to be part of Belmau's future, be there. And then I turned and left. Not in anger. Not in triumph. Just with the quiet resolve of someone finally stepping into her rightful space, not to dominate, but to lead. The next morning, sunlight filtered through frosted glass as I entered the conference room. It was still early, but the warmth in the air made everything feel a little lighter. I stood alone at the head of the table, behind the old painting Grandpa had hung there years ago, of a lone bird flying above a mountain range. Underneath, in silver script, the words, "Freedom is not escape from others. It's understanding yourself." And one by one, they came. My father was first. Then Natalie. Then Aunt Carol and Uncle Gregory. Madison came quietly, no makeup, no designer heels. Finally, my mother stepped in, wearing the same shawl from the welcome dinner. But she looked different now. Like someone standing in a place they no longer felt entitled to, but still hoped to be welcomed. I opened the folder in front of me and spoke. "This isn't about accusing anyone," I said. "Last night was enough. This is about building something new." Inside the folder was a proposal. The Whitmore Family Foundation. I want to create a family council, not to manage Belmau, but to oversee the community programs I've started. Scholarships. Local arts. Small business mentorships. A legacy not just in stone, but in service. Natalie sat up straighter. "Like an ethical advisory board?" "Exactly," I said. There was a pause, then Uncle Gregory asked, "And the hotel shares?" "I retain full ownership," I replied. "But the trust allows me to allocate partial equity over time, to those who show long-term commitment. Not with words. With action. There won't be equal splits, and no one will win me over with praise. Trust has to be earned." Even Madison nodded in understanding. "And who decides?" she asked. "I do," I said without flinching. "But the decisions will be based on evaluations, from staff, from community partners, from results. It'll be transparent. No emotion. No favoritism." Silence followed, but not the suffocating kind. The thoughtful kind. My mother was the first to speak. "I don't know if I deserve to be part of this," she said. "But if you're opening that door, I'll step through it. One step at a time." I nodded. No promises. No guarantees. Just a space for something to begin. My father, still solemn, added quietly, "I don't need shares, Joyce. I just want to do one good thing. Like your grandfather used to say, do good, not just well." Then Madison raised her hand, almost like a child in school. "If you ever need someone to help with communication, for the foundation or community projects, I'd like to offer my skills." She smiled, not forced. Not polished. Just human. I smiled back. "Then let's get to work." 1 year later, I stood at the top floor of the Belmau Hotel, looking out over Half Moon Bay. The water shimmered under the morning sun, waves breaking gently against the rocks. Below, laughter echoed from the garden courtyard, real laughter, not the brittle kind that used to fill our reunion dinners. Children were playing near the newly constructed swing set, part of the hotel's scholarship initiative, the Whitmore Rising program. The same hotel where I'd once been exiled to a moldy room beside the laundry chute was now a center of opportunity, for others, and for my family, too. But not because I handed them anything. Because they chose to show up differently. That program, the scholarships, the youth classes, the creative healing workshops, was the first major project launched under the Whitmore Family Foundation. The plan I'd introduced in that conference room a year ago was no longer a proposal. It had become a living, breathing legacy. And it was working. We allocated 5% of Belmau's annual profits toward education for underprivileged youth, with the goal of offering not just financial aid, but mentorship, hands-on skills, and emotional support. Within 12 months, we'd awarded 14 full scholarships and funded a culinary program led by none other than Chef Raymond. Room 116, the one they used to throw me into like a basement for the unwanted, was no longer a guest room. We turned it into the Charles Whitmore Heritage Gallery. It housed architectural models, business letters, and most importantly, the only photo I had of my grandfather and me. A photo taken when I was 10, sitting on his lap, both of us laughing at something I no longer remembered. My mother now visited Belmau weekly. Not to give orders, but to volunteer. I used to think art was a luxury, she said one soft afternoon as she guided a calligraphy class for our elder guests. Turns out it's what holds people together. She'd proposed the program herself, healing through creativity, and while she still carried the habits of a woman who once demanded control, something inside her had changed. She no longer arrived expecting respect. She earned it with her time and her quiet effort. Madison's transformation was slower but sincere. She had left Robert a few months after he stormed out of that banquet room. There were no grand gestures, no declarations. Just a quiet divorce filing and a farewell that surprised none of us. What did surprise me was the way she began showing up. First, she offered to help me rebrand our foundation. Then she offered to design promotional materials. Eventually, she became head of communications for Belmau's social responsibility programs. She didn't talk much about Robert anymore. She didn't have to. One day, she showed up at my office holding a design draft, a logo for our scholarship program. "It's just a sketch," she said, laying the paper gently on my desk. I looked down. It was an image of a bird, wings outstretched, rising from a ripple of waves, with a small phrase beneath it. "Rise quietly. Rise truly." I stared at it for a long moment. It was simple. But it was perfect. "I think Belmau deserves a symbol that reflects what it really stands for now," she said. "Not just luxury. But opportunity." I nodded. "We'll use it." My father found his place too. He'd always been a man of spreadsheets and market indexes, but in the last year, he started mentoring local young people in an entrepreneurship group we sponsored. Twice a week, he met with students from lower-income schools and taught them how to build business plans, seek funding, and recover from setbacks. Every time I talk about my own mistakes, he told me during one of our foundation meetings, "I feel closer to your grandfather." He didn't ask for shares. Or recognition. Just a role. Just purpose. And then there was Robert. He came back. Not with swagger. Not with apologies dripping in excuses. He walked into my office one rainy Wednesday morning and said, "I know I don't deserve your trust. But if you believe in second chances, I'd like to prove I can do better." I didn't say yes immediately. I put him through every standard hiring process. I reviewed his references. I spoke to people outside the family. When I finally gave him a contract, it was for a junior role on our business development team, under supervision. And to his credit, he earned his place. Quietly. No boasting. No side deals. Maybe for the first time in his life, Robert understood that power doesn't come from grabbing. It comes from holding what you're given with grace. One day, I passed him in the hallway as he was reviewing partner proposals with our logistics coordinator. He didn't look up, didn't smile, didn't try to remind me that he was trying. He just worked. That was enough. I came to understand something I hadn't before. Revenge wasn't the point. At least, not in the way I used to think. It wasn't about making them suffer the way they made me suffer. It was about showing that healing can be louder than humiliation. That real power doesn't come from slamming doors. It comes from opening them and choosing who gets to walk through. That evening, I returned to the Heritage Gallery and sat in front of the photo of Grandpa Charles. The same old bench beneath it, the same quote etched into the wood. "Don't build for the world's applause. Build for the echo that lasts." Soft piano music played from the gallery speakers. I whispered, "You were right." It wasn't about proving I belonged. It was about proving that grace has more endurance than pride. Outside, the ocean rolled in soft waves. The sky glowed purple with the last light of day. And inside me, for the first time in nearly 40 years, there was peace. Not because they finally saw me. but because I had stopped needing them to. Fall rolled in quietly that year. The sea mist hung low in the mornings, cloaking Half Moon Bay in a delicate silver fog. Guests at the Belmau Hotel began arriving wrapped in scarves and soft wool coats, the scent of cinnamon and driftwood trailing in behind them. The seasons were changing, and not just outside. Inside the hotel, everything had shifted. The energy, the rhythm, the way the staff smiled at guests. It wasn't just a luxury escape anymore. It had become a sanctuary, for guests and for us. I sat in my office, the very one my grandfather once used, surrounded by clean lines and soft light. On the desk, a notebook lay open, filled with handwritten notes for our upcoming Whitmore Youth Arts Conference. We'd secured keynote speakers, partnered with 3 Bay Area schools, and even convinced a local orchestra to perform live. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. It was Savannah, the red-haired barista who had once quietly drawn my logo on a coffee lid. She smiled, holding a cup in both hands. "I added cinnamon," she said. "Just like you liked it last November." I smiled. "Thank you, Savannah. How's your brother doing? You said he had his first college interview this week." Her face lit up. "He got accepted. Full ride to UC Santa Cruz. He said to tell you thank you. That if you hadn't helped him with the recommendation letter, he wouldn't have made it." I nodded, trying to hold back the emotion swelling in my chest. "He did it himself. I just helped him believe it was possible." After she left, I looked out the window again, eyes drifting to the now thriving garden courtyard. That space had once been an unused patch of dry lawn. Now it was filled with raised planter boxes, benches, and even a mural, painted by our scholarship students. It showed a young girl standing at the edge of the ocean, wings sprouting from her back, a bluefinch perched on her shoulder. Below it, the words, "Let your silence become strength." Those weren't my words. They were taken from one of the letters my grandfather had written but never sent. But I'd made them part of our hotel's legacy because they captured everything I'd ever lived through. There was still friction sometimes. Old habits don't dissolve overnight. Aunt Carol occasionally asked leading questions about asset division. Uncle Gregory still tried to assert himself as a business consultant, despite offering ideas that hadn't evolved since 1997. But now, I had boundaries. Clear ones. And they either respected them or they quietly left the room. My mother no longer corrected me in public. She'd started asking instead of assuming. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. One morning, I walked into the sunroom where she was showing guests how to do watercolor brushstrokes. She looked up at me and smiled, not the smile of performance, but of peace. "I submitted an idea to the council," she said. "A program for bereaved guests. Those traveling after losing someone. I thought we could offer grief journaling and memory bookmaking." I was quiet for a moment. "That's beautiful," I said. She nodded, then added softly, "I wish I had something like that when my father passed. Maybe I wouldn't have been so cold to everyone." Her eyes met mine. "To you. I didn't offer comfort. I didn't brush it away. I just let her speak. Because sometimes, silence is the best mirror." Madison had grown, too. She still struggled, I could tell. The divorce had left her in a strange limbo, untethered from the man she thought was her future, and unsure how to be seen without him. But she worked hard. Not for show, but for impact. One evening, I found her sitting in the staff lounge, reviewing volunteer placements for an upcoming literacy event. "You're here late," I said, slipping into the chair beside her. She shrugged. "I guess I feel like, if I can help people find their voice, maybe I'll finally figure out my own." I placed my hand gently on the table beside hers. "You've already started." She looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in years. "I was wrong about you, Joyce. I thought you were weak because you didn't fight. But you were the strongest one all along." You just fought differently. I smiled faintly. I fought in silence. Because if I'd screamed, they would have called me emotional. If I'd argued, they would have said I was bitter. But if I listened, waited, worked, eventually the truth would make its own noise. And it did. That winter, Belmau was awarded a regional honor for its contribution to inclusive education and community development. News outlets featured us not just as a luxury destination, but as a blueprint for modern legacy stewardship. The day the award came, I held it in my hands, not for the photo op, not for the press release, but because I wanted to remember the weight of what it meant. Not just the hotel, but the lives. The ripple. Later that evening, I invited the entire foundation team to the rooftop terrace. The wind was crisp, and lights sparkled across the bay. Tonight, I began, standing before the gathered crowd, we're not celebrating an award. We're celebrating every person who showed up when it mattered. Every time you helped someone rise quietly. I looked at my mother, who stood near the railing, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. I looked at Madison, who held a clipboard in one hand and a cup of cocoa in the other. And then I looked up, at the sky stretching wide above us, no longer heavy with expectation. Belmau was more than a hotel now. It was a place where people could be rebuilt. And I finally knew what my grandfather meant when he wrote, "Anyone can inherit a building. Few can inherit its soul." Because I hadn't just inherited Belmau. I had restored its soul. And in doing so, I had reclaimed mine. 1 year, 8 months, and 21 days after I stepped into Belmau Hotel as the invisible daughter, I stood beneath its chandeliers as its owner, its steward, and, perhaps most unexpectedly, its compass. The grand ballroom gleamed. But tonight, it wasn't dressed in gold or marble. It was filled with folding chairs, art displays from our scholarship recipients, and handwritten notes from guests who had found peace, growth, or comfort within these walls. The gala wasn't about luxury tonight. It was about what we'd built, what we'd chosen to become. I moved through the crowd slowly, stopping to hug former guests, staff, volunteers. Each person had their own story. A woman who had written her first poem in our grief journaling class. A teenage boy who'd gotten his first job through our hospitality apprentice program. A single father who'd once stayed here in silence after losing his wife, now coordinating monthly workshops for other widowers. Every hallway at Belmau whispered transformation now. Even room 116. Earlier that morning, I had stepped inside it alone. The air was warm, the lights soft. The space now bore new wallpaper, restored wood, and a small plaque on the door that read, "From silence to strength, this was the beginning." On the nightstand sat a guest book, open to messages from visitors reflecting on moments of quiet pain and healing. Some were raw. Others hopeful. Each one proof that what we'd started had meaning. I returned to the ballroom just as the lights dimmed. It was time. Savannah, now our hotel's guest services lead, took the mic and introduced the closing speaker, me. I walked onto the small stage, the old Belmau crest softly glowing behind me. I took a deep breath and spoke, not with force, but with quiet certainty. 2 years ago, I walked into this hotel and was handed a key to a room next to the laundry chute. My family was here. But I was still invisible. What they didn't know was that I already owned this building. A ripple of knowing laughter passed through the crowd. Not mocking, empathetic. I didn't tell them. Not because I wanted revenge. But because I needed to know who they were when they thought I had nothing. And more importantly, who I still was, after all those years of being told I didn't measure up. I paused. My mother once said I didn't need her to succeed. And that's why she resented me. Gasps. Murmurs. Even now, some people weren't ready for the depth of truth I'd chosen to share so freely. But I've come to learn, I continued, that the greatest success isn't proving people wrong. It's building something right. Even when no one claps for you. Even when you're alone in a moldy room with nothing but belief in yourself. I looked around the room. Familiar eyes. Former doubters. And family, real family now, not by blood, but by action. My grandfather didn't leave Belmau to me because I was the smartest or the most accomplished. He left it to me because I was the only one willing to see people without armor. He believed that legacy wasn't about what you pass down. It's about what you lift up. A long silence followed. The kind filled with emotion, not awkwardness. Then, a voice spoke up from the back of the room. It was my mother. She stepped forward slowly, her hands clasped in front of her. She didn't ask for the mic. She just met my eyes. I tried to mold Joyce into someone I understood, she said, her voice slightly hoarse but firm. And when she chose her own path, I saw it as defiance instead of courage. But everything she's done here, it's made me realize that real love doesn't come with conditions. It comes with learning how to let someone become who they are. She turned to the crowd. And I was wrong. She walked up the stage steps and took my hand. The applause that followed was thunderous, not because of drama, but because of healing. That night, I didn't go home to an empty condo or retreat to my office. I walked down to the beach behind Belmau and stood barefoot at the edge of the tide. The same ocean that had once felt cold and endless now felt like a reflection. Not of what I had endured, but of how far I had come. I thought about my grandfather. About the journal entries he'd written and never sent. About the note he left in the trust. If they ever ask why, tell them this: Joyce saw the cracks and didn't run. She filled them. I closed my eyes and let the wind brush against my face. I had not taken revenge. I had taken the moldy room and built a legacy out of it. And no one could ever take that from me. Success isn't just what you earn, it's what you build quietly when no one is watching. Thank you for listening to my story. If this touched something in you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that quiet strength is still strength. That dignity doesn't shout. It endures. And that sometimes, the best revenge is simply thriving without needing permission. Subscribe to Revenge Echoes for more stories where pain becomes power, and silence becomes your loudest voice.